They called it a briefing, but it was a sentencing chamber dressed in uniform cloth. The hall sat beneath the command spire like a swollen organ under bone. Low ceiling, riveted plates. The air filtered until it had no mercy left in it. Every breath tasted of hot metal and stale incense, and under that, the sharp sting of ozone from overworked lumen strips that flickered like eyelids refusing to close. The benches were arranged in perfect rows, the kind of geometry that makes men feel replaceable. I took my place where the painted numeral on the floor told me to stand, not where I wanted, not near anyone I knew, where the paint said. There were many of us, but we were not a crowd. We were a resource list waiting to be read. In front, on a dais bolted to the deck, a lectern waited like a gallows. Behind it hung the banner of our regiment. Threadbare cloth with a double-headed symbol stitched in old gold that had dulled to the color of dried bile. Beneath it, an attendant in grey robes hovered over stacks of parchment, wetting a seal with his tongue and pressing it into wax with the bored rhythm of a man performing a task he had already done 1,000 times today. The seals made a sound, soft, final, intimate, a damp click, like a bolt sliding home in a chamber. I still hear that sound when I try to sleep. They made us wait. Waiting is the Empire's first lesson, waiting in lines, waiting for permits, waiting for an officer to glance at you and decide whether you exist today. In that hall we waited while the bureaucracy cleared its throat. A vox horn crackled at the rear. Attention, attendance verification commencing, maintain posture, maintain silence, maintain faith. The words were machine flat, as if faith were an item that could be measured and weighed and stamped. A few men shuffled their boots. Immediately a watch servo floated down the aisle, its lens blinking, its speaker hissing. Stillness is obedience, obedience is survival. The servo smelled of lubricants and old blood under its casing, the sour sweetness of something organic that had been scrubbed and never truly cleaned. The officer arrived without ceremony, which is to say, with perfect ceremony. He did not stride in like a hero. He did not pause for effect. He entered as paperwork enters a file, inevitable, unquestioned, already approved. He wore a coat stiff with formal starch and battlefield grime that had been polished into respectability. His cap brim shadowed his eyes. His face had the tired arrogance of someone who has survived long enough to mistake survival for virtue. At his side walked a cleric, thin as a blade, swinging a censer that spilled cheap smoke. The smoke did not rise like blessing, it clung low, a crawling thing that insinuated itself into mouths and nostrils. It made the back of my throat itch, it made my eyes water. It made some men feel holy. The officer placed a hand on the lectern. The parchment stack beside him was bound with wire and stamped with more seals than any single truth could ever require. The cleric murmured, and the attendant behind them pressed another wax mark. One more small click in the chain that would end with bodies. By authority vested, the officer began, and there it was, the voice of the Imperium, dry and vast, a voice that could turn a man into a statistic without raising its tone. You are assigned to Operation Routine Compliance. Routine, they said it like a prayer, like a charm against chaos, as if naming something routine could make it safe, as if repetition were absolution. I had heard the word before, everyone has. It is always attached to the missions no one returns from. Routine patrol, routine sweep, routine extraction. It is the word they use when they want you to stop asking questions, when they want you to offer up your fear as a tithe and call it courage. The officer read from the parchment as if his eyes were chained to it. Names and numbers, unit designations. Objectives described in terms so clean they felt obscene. Primary task, reinforce existing cordon. Secondary task, secure communication integrity. Tertiary task, ensure local compliance within designated sector. He paused, and the parchment rustled like dead leaves. Opposition assessed as minimal. Environmental hazards within acceptable limits. Minimal, acceptable. The language of men who will not be there when the limits break. I looked down at my hands while he spoke. My knuckles were cracked, stained with old soot. Under my nails, grime from the barracks latrine. My hands were the only thing about me that felt real in that moment. They were warm. They shook faintly. I pressed my thumbs into my palms until the trembling had somewhere to go. Around me, the other guardsmen stood with their eyes forward, faces blanked by discipline or exhaustion or the hollowing effect of long obedience. A few whispered litanies, not loudly, not with hope, just enough to feel like they were doing something besides waiting to die. The cleric stepped forward when the officer finished the first portion. His voice was softer, and somehow that made it worse. "Let your doubts be recorded as sin and purged by action," he said. "Let your blood be a signature the enemy cannot contest. The Emperor's bureaucracy is infinite. It will find you, even in death." I wondered if that was comfort or threat. In the Imperium, the difference is mostly one of tone. Then came the issuing. Servitors rolled in on track wheels, metal fingers clasping crates, ocular lenses glazed and unblinking. Their skin, what remained of it, had the waxy pallor of meat stored too long. I caught the smell as they passed. Antiseptic oil, and something faintly sweet that made my stomach turn. A port on one servitor's neck dribbled clear fluid, and no one acknowledged it. Nothing is acknowledged unless it interferes with the schedule. A Munitorum quartermaster, more clerk than soldier, stood beside a table set with equipment. He did not look up as we approached. He stared at his slate, stylus scratching, lips moving silently as he counted. When my turn came, he held out a small ration slate like a sacrament. "Designation?" he asked. I spoke my unit code, the code I had been taught to answer to. My birth name was something my mother used once, back when she still had a mouthful of teeth and the air in our hab block didn't smell of rust. Here, the code was all that mattered. He tapped it into his slate, and the slate beeped. "Litany chits," he said, sliding thin strips of parchment into my palm. Each chit bore printed prayers and compliance affirmations, numbered and perforated for easy accounting. "Recite at designated intervals. Failure to recite will be treated as morale deviation." Morale deviation. Even fear had a classification. He handed me ammunition next. Clean rounds in sealed boxes, the kind of supplies that only appear when the forms are immaculate and the lives are cheap. The box edges were sharp enough to cut. The seal wax bore the impression of a cog and a skull. I ran a finger over it and felt the raised ridges like scars. "Sign," the quartermaster said. There was a ledger thick and smudged from 100 hands. A quill lay in a groove, its tip already split and black with ink. I signed where a line waited for me, and the ink sank into the paper like blood into cloth. My name looked wrong there, too human for the grid around it. The quartermaster did not react. He simply turned the page and slid the ledger toward the next man. Then the counter-signatures began. 2 officers, 1 clerk, 1 stamp with a dull thunk, another stamp, another. Each time my name was pushed lower, covered by approval marks, smudged by authority, overwritten by process until it felt less like a signature and more like evidence that I had been processed, filed, stored. I remember thinking absurdly that if I died, the name would still be there under the ink and seals, not as memory, as record. When the issuing ended, we were directed to a second table where our identification tags were updated. A thin priest of the administratum, shaved head, ink-stained fingers, attached a new strip of metal to my chain. It was stamped with the operation code. The tag was cold as a corpse's tooth. He clipped it on without looking at my face, and I felt a sudden irrational urge to seize his wrist and ask him if he knew what he was doing to us. I didn't. Of course I didn't. In the Imperium, you do not grab the wrist that stamps you. You offer your flesh and call it duty. The officer returned to the lectern for final remarks. All personnel will report to transit in accordance with timetable designation. Any deviation will be punished as sabotage. Any discussion of mission parameters beyond authorized channels will be punished as sedition. Authorized channels. That meant nothing more than, do not speak unless you are spoken through. He dismissed us with a gesture, and we filed out in rows, boots scraping, equipment clinking. The exit corridor was narrow, lined with devotional plaques and safety notices. Breathe shallow in case of gas. Report mutations immediately. Cleanliness is purity. The lumen strips buzzed overhead, and in the corners, old incense had gathered in greasy clumps like dead insects. Outside the hall the air changed. It was warmer, thicker, tainted with promethium from idling engines somewhere deeper in the depot. It mixed with the cheap incense still clinging to my uniform, and the combination made me nauseous. Men spoke in low voices now that we were out of the hall, but the words were small, cautious. No one wanted to be the first to say the obvious. Routine means someone else has already decided how you will die. I walked toward the muster corridor with my issued kit pressed against my ribs, feeling the weight of it like an accusation. The ration slate clacked softly with each step. The litany chits whispered against my glove. I could taste metal on my tongue. Ozone still burned in my nostrils. The sound of seal stamps followed me, not literally, but in my skull, click, 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 like the final closing of doors. And as I moved with the others, I felt something settle in me, heavy and calm, not courage, not even acceptance. Just the certainty that the mission had been decided without us, and the paperwork had already outlived our bodies. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter? They marched us down into the hive's underside, the way you'd feed meat into a grinder, orderly, numbered, and with a priest present to bless the machinery. The stairwells were too narrow for comfort and too tall for mercy, a spine of ferrocrete and rivets that led away from the clean lie of the briefing hall and into the true body of the city. Every landing held a warning plaque, stamped metal bolted into the wall. No loitering, no prayer unless authorized. Report unsanctioned weeping. The letters were worn smooth where generations of gloved hands had brushed them, as if even the language of control was being eroded by sheer volume of the controlled. By the time we reached the depot level, the air had changed so completely it felt like stepping into someone else's lungs. The hive breathed down here. It breathed hot and wet and poisoned. Condensation slicked the walls in long tears that never finished falling, and the moisture carried a chemical tang that stung my eyes. All disinfectant, coolant runoff, and the sour hint of mold trying to grow despite the Emperor's disapproval. Lumen strips buzzed overhead with the exhausted flicker of tired prayers. Half of them were dead, and the living half pulsed like a failing heartbeat. The ash depot was a cavern carved out of necessity and kept running out of fear. It was not a place where men gathered. It was a place where bodies were staged. Rows of painted lines divided the floor into grids, and each grid bore a designation stencil, Lot A17, Lot A18, and so on, as if we were cargo awaiting dispatch. Above each lot hung chains and hooks, some empty, some supporting crates wrapped in oily canvas, some supporting things I tried not to look at too long. There were always servitors in these places. There were always enough servitors to remind you that flesh is only valuable when it is obedient. They herded us into our assigned lot and made us stand at attention while the clerks came. I remember the clerks more vividly than my squad because the clerks did not pretend. Soldiers still wore masks. Bravery, comradeship, small jokes that tried to keep the dark out. Clerks had no such weakness. They were the true face of the Imperium, pale hands, inked fingernails, eyes that could glance at a man and see only a discrepancy in a tally. The first one approached with a slate in one hand and a measuring rod in the other, as if my height and weight were tactical secrets. He smelled of paper dust and medicinal alcohol. His robe hem was stained where it dragged through puddles on the deck. When he spoke, it wasn't to me, it was to his slate. Unit, step forward, present tags. I stepped forward. The tag chain at my neck clinked against my collarbone. I held it out. He did not take it with his fingers. He touched it with the rod like a man prodding rot to see how deep the decay went, and the rod's end beeped. Confirmed, he said, still not looking at my face. Next. There was no malice in his voice. That was the worst part. He wasn't cruel in the way a sadist is cruel. He was cruel the way a door is cruel when it shuts on your hand. Indifferent, designed, blameless. Behind him, another clerk rolled a cart that carried syringes and stamped brass seals. A third walked with a branding tool, an ugly, heated thing that hummed faintly like a small animal trapped in a box. I watched it with a sick fascination. In the brief, they had given me ammunition because the forms were in order. Here they gave me pain for the same reason. Vaccination compliance, the syringe clerk announced. Extend left arm. Failure will be recorded as refusal of Imperial mercy. Imperial mercy was a needle. I extended my arm. The glove came off. The air kissed my skin with wet cold. The syringe went in without warning. The needle thick enough that I felt its separate muscle. The fluid burned as it spread, hot and itching, and I fought the reflex to pull away. The clerk's hand was steady, practiced. He'd probably vaccinated 1,000 arms this shift. He wiped the bead of blood with a cloth already stained by other men. The cloth smelled faintly of copper and vinegar. The branding tool came next. Unit mark, the brand clerk said, and his voice had the casual tone of a man sealing a crate. I'd been branded before in training. Small marks on the inner wrist. A code that said I belonged to a regiment, to a bureaucracy, to a war machine. This was different. This was deeper. This was the depot's way of declaring that whatever happened on the other side of the gates, they would be able to identify the remains. He pressed the tool against my shoulder through the fabric of my uniform, and the heat bit through cloth like a hungry mouth. The smell of scorched textile rose instantly, burnt fibers and the sharp sweet stink of singed skin. Pain flared bright enough to whiten my vision. I kept my teeth clenched. I kept my posture. Behind my eyes, I saw the briefing hall again, the seals clicking, the officer's mouth forming the word routine. When the brand lifted, the fabric had fused slightly to my skin. I could feel the mark throbbing underneath, a new heartbeat that didn't belong to me. Compliance complete, the clerk said, and moved on. I stood there a moment longer, arm burning, shoulder raw, and realized the Imperium's greatest talent is making you grateful for not being punished worse. A man becomes thankful for being processed. They weighed us next. A scale platform sat in the center of the lot, a slab of metal with rust at its seams and a devotional etching on its edge, an engraved skull surrounded by tiny script. Someone had carved prayers into the machinery as if words could sanctify measurement. Each man stepped up and the scale whined, and a number appeared on a flickering display. The clerk recorded it. A number, a weight, another entry in a ledger that would outlive us. When my turn came, I stepped onto the platform and felt it vibrate faintly under my boots, as if the machine resented being asked to notice me. The display flashed my mass in harsh digits. The clerk frowned, tapped his stylus, and the frown disappeared. Whatever my body was, it fit into their range. That was all that mattered. To the side, a small booth had been set up, canvas walls, a slit for a window, and inside, an officer of the medical corps sat with a respirator mask and tired eyes. Men who coughed too wetly were directed there. I watched one of them, a young trooper with a face still soft with youth, walk in, shoulders hunched. He did not come out. A servitor later rolled away a sealed bag. The clerk marked something on his slate. The line advanced. That was the mood down there, morgue quiet. Not peaceful, not respectful, just quiet because speech was inefficient, and inefficiency is the only sin the Munitorum never forgives. The depot was filled with sounds, but none of them were human in the way that matters. The constant distant groan of hive engines, the drip of condensation hitting metal, the buzz of lumen strips, the scratch of styluses, the occasional cough, wet and final like a man trying to expel his own lungs. When someone whispered a prayer, it felt like a crime committed in the open. Our squad leader, if that title still meant anything, tried to speak to us in low tones. He muttered about readiness, about maintaining weapon discipline, about watching each other's backs. The words hit the air and fell dead, not because we didn't believe him, but because belief is hard when you can see the machinery of your own disposal. I kept looking at the clerks at how easily they moved through us. I kept thinking, they will remember our numbers, they will forget our faces, they will forget our voices. The ledger will be correct, the graves will be approximate. Time passed strangely. The depot had no windows, it had no sky, it had only schedules. We waited as crates were rolled past, as pallets of ammunition were stamped and restamped, as servitors hauled Vox components and coils of wire that looked like intestinal loops. Overhead, a loudspeaker rattled to life every so often with an instruction in that same flat, righteous tone: maintain spacing. Hydration in accordance with allotment. Unauthorized sleep will be punished. Even rest required permission. At some point, a clerk approached our lot with a stack of papers held tight to his chest as if they were holy relics. Transit assignment, he announced. Attend. Receive. He began calling unit codes. When he called mine, I stepped forward and accepted a thin slip of parchment. It was warm, as if it had been in contact with his body too long. It bore my designation, my lot number, my embarkation time. Below that, stamped in red, a phrase I had seen on other forms: failure to comply is treason. A routine mission, and already treason hovered like a blade. I folded the slip and put it inside my breast pocket, where it sat against my heart like an accusation. I could feel the paper through the fabric, could feel how flimsy it was, how easily it could tear. And yet that piece of paper could condemn me more surely than any enemy bullet. Lose it, and you become unaccounted. Unaccounted becomes suspect. Suspect becomes guilty. Guilty becomes dead, officially, neatly, with a clerk's sigh. A trooper beside me, older, scarred, his eyes too steady, leaned close enough that I smelled the sourness of unwashed fatigue on him. Routine, he whispered, like he was tasting the word and finding it rotten. That's what they call it when they don't plan to pay for our return. I should have answered. I should have said something brave or foolish. But my mouth was dry, and my thoughts felt like they had been weighed and found wanting. All I could do was nod once, small, a motion too slight to be recorded. Then the gates opened. They were huge sliding doors at the far end of the depot, each one a slab of metal thick enough to stop artillery. Warning lights blinked above them in slow, patient rhythm. When they parted, the sound was like the hive's jaw unhinging. A gust of air rolled in, hotter, fouler, and with it came a smell that cut through everything else: burned dust. Not smoke, not fresh fire. Burned dust, the scent of things that have been incinerated and ground into powder, and then left to settle into every crack. It lodged in my nostrils immediately. It tasted like old graves. Beyond the doors stretched a corridor lined with pipes and cabling. The floor was coated in grey residue that clung to boots. The lights were dimmer there, and the shadows deeper. Somewhere far ahead I could hear engines idling, a heavy thrum like a beast waiting to be fed. We were ordered forward, lot by lot, row by row. As we stepped out of the depot's grid and into the corridor, I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of combat. It was the sensation of moving from one file drawer to the next, from one stage of processing to another. Routine. It followed us like a brand that reached deeper than skin. Down the corridor, the burned dust thickened, and the air grew harder to breathe. I realized, with a cold clarity, that the trap wasn't sprung in some distant battlefield. The trap began here, in the ash depot, with clerks who never learned our names and stamps that clicked like bolts closing. I wanted to confess something then, out loud to anyone. But there were only uniforms and schedules and the hive's endless machinery. So I held the confession in my throat and swallowed it like poison, and marched. They loaded us into the lander the way they loaded everything else, by category, by weight, by the neat tyranny of a manifest. The embarkation bay was a throat of iron, lit in jaundiced strips that made skin look sickly and uniforms look like burial cloth. I stood in line with my kit biting into my shoulders, the new brand on my arm throbbing under the fabric every time I shifted. A pair of servitors guided traffic with mechanical batons, their gestures slow and absolute. Each time the line stalled, a voxcaster somewhere overhead barked for us to maintain forward momentum, as if momentum were a virtue and not merely the absence of refusal. At the foot of the ramp, a clerk sat behind a folding lectern bolted to the deck. He was young enough to still have softness around his eyes, but that softness was swallowed by the mask of duty, respirator, ink-stained gloves, a slate chain to his wrist. He did not look up when my turn came. He held out his stylus like a syringe. "Transit slip," he said. I produced the thin parchment from my breast pocket. It was damp now from my sweat, the ink slightly blurred, my designation still legible because the Emperor protects paperwork even when he does not protect men. The clerk pressed the parchment to a scanner plate. It beeped. He stamped it with a small metal device that left a red imprint, and the sound, clack, hit my ears like a verdict. "Embarked," he said. "Proceed." The stamp had bled through slightly, and for a moment I stared at the red mark like it was my own blood. Not even a drop, not even a smear, and yet it was somehow more final than any wound, an official record that I had been moved from one place to another. A life reduced to logistics. The lander's interior was cramped and reeked of old promethium, hot wiring, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies sealed together. Bench seats ran along the walls, each with restraint straps and a small engraved plaque bearing a prayer for safe transit, prayers that had been scratched over by knife points and replaced with cruder words. The deck plates vibrated beneath my boots. Above, the ceiling was low enough that taller men hunched instinctively, as if already learning how to live smaller. A Vox adept stood near the forward bulkhead, plugged into the ship with cables sprouting from his skull like roots. He wore the hooded red of his order, but it was stained grey with ash. His mouth was half hidden behind a grill, and his voice came out through a speaker that made it sound like two men talking at once. "Attention, embarked personnel," he intoned. "Compliance phrases will be recited at designated intervals to maintain morale within acceptable thresholds." Acceptable thresholds. The words followed me everywhere now. I could feel them pressing on my ribs. A few men chuckled nervously, the kind of humor that tries to buy time from terror. Someone muttered a joke about how the ship would crash less if the Munitorum stamped the sky correctly. The laughter died quickly. The lander shuddered as engines spooled, and the sound filled the cabin with a heavy roar that made thought feel like a candle in wind. The restraints were mandatory. An armored trooper with a face like carved stone moved down the line, yanking straps tight with practiced force. When he reached me, he pulled my harness so hard it bit into my clavicle. The metal buckle clicked shut, and the noise joined the growing chorus in my head, stamps, bolts, locks, small sounds of closure. I sat and tried to keep my breathing steady. The air was thin and tasted of recycled sweat and machine breath. A man across from me, eyes too wide, hands clasping his tags, mouthed prayers so fast his lips looked like they were trembling from cold. Another man stared at the deck between his boots, as if staring hard enough could turn iron into ground and ground into home. The Vox adept began the compliance phrases. "Repeat," he said. His speaker crackled. The cabin lights dimmed, then flared. Somewhere in the hull something metal scraped, a sound like a knife dragged along a coffin lid. "Repeat," he insisted. We answered because answering was easier than not. "Faith is breath," we said. "Obedience is armor." The phrases were meant to organize fear into neat lines, to make panic something that could be scheduled and audited. I felt the words leave my mouth like ash, weightless and useless. Still, I said them. I said them because a servitor's lens watched from the corner, because a commissarial trooper stood near the ramp with a hand resting on his sidearm, because in the Imperium the only safe emotion is compliance. The lander lifted. At first it was a gentle rise, like an elevator shuddering up a shaft. Then the engines caught properly, and the whole craft surged upward with a violence that slammed my spine into the bench. Men grunted as straps tightened. The roar deepened into a sustained howl, and the deck vibration turned into a constant teeth-rattling tremor. Through the small porthole beside me, the hive slipped away, layered metal platforms, smokestacks belching, lumen windows like a million tired eyes. Then cloud and smog swallowed everything, and for a brief moment we were blind in a grey womb of vapors. My stomach rolled. Someone vomited, the smell of bile mixed with promethium and old incense trapped in fabric. The Vox Adept spoke again, voice strained by static. "Maintain recitation, maintain posture, maintain—" The first impact cut him off. The lander jolted sideways as if punched. A metallic clang rang through the hull, followed by a shriek of stressed rivets. The cabin tilted, my shoulders slammed into the man beside me. He hissed in pain, but no one apologized. Apology is a luxury for the living, and we were not sure we qualified. Flak. The anti-air fire was not seen at first, only felt. Vibrations through the frame, the sudden changes in trajectory, the way the pilot fought the air like a man wrestling a beast. Then through the porthole I saw it, black bursts blooming in the sky, each one a violent flower of smoke and shrapnel. Trails of tracer fire stitched upward like angry scripture. The pilot's voice came over the internal vox, tinny and cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hold tight back there, minor turbulence, we are on schedule." On schedule. As if the sky itself were required to honor the timetable. Another hit. The lights went out for a heartbeat, replaced by emergency red. The cabin filled with the strobing glow of warning sigils. Men's faces looked like masks carved from raw meat. The smell of overheated wiring seeped into the air, sharp and bitter. A trooper near the ramp began to cry, silently at first, then with a choking sound. He tried to hide it by pressing his forearm to his mouth. The commissarial trooper took one step toward him. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by frantic swallowing. Fear refiled itself into the proper category. The Vox Adept resumed, voice now more desperate than devout. Compliance phrases, repeat, repeat, repeat. We obeyed, and our voices layered over the roar and the impacts like a pathetic hymn. "Faith is breath," we said, while the cabin shook. "Obedience is armor," we said, while the hull rang with shrapnel. A scream cut through the cabin, high, sudden. I twisted in my straps and saw why. A piece of metal had punched through the side paneling near the ceiling, a jagged shard protruding like a tooth. It had found a man's neck. He was still strapped in, eyes bulging, blood spraying in hot arcs that splattered the ceiling and rained down in thick drops. The smell hit a second later, iron, warm and animal. The man beside him tried to unbuckle his restraint to help, fingers fumbling. The armored trooper slammed his hand down. "Stay restrained," he barked. "Protocol, protocol." The dead man gurgled, trying to breathe around the metal in his throat, and the word protocol hung in the air like an excuse. The bleeding man's boots kicked weakly. His heels thudded against the deck. The sound was small, rhythmic, almost polite, like someone knocking to be let out of a room. Then his legs went still. His eyes remained open. The lander continued to climb. The schedule did not pause. I forced my gaze away, but the image burned itself into my mind. The way his mouth worked soundlessly, the way his blood steamed slightly where it hit a warm panel, the way no one dared move too much because movement was unauthorized. The Imperium doesn't just teach you to die, it teaches you to witness death correctly. Through the porthole, the sky brightened. We punched through the smog layer into a higher band where sunlight existed only as a pale smear behind chemical haze. Below, the battlefield spread like a wound, cratered land, black scars of bombardment, smoke columns twisting upward. I saw flashes, muzzle fire, explosions, the bright stabs of energy weapons. It looked almost beautiful from above, like a storm caught in slow motion. Then the lander dropped slightly, and I remembered beauty is just distance from suffering. The pilot spoke again. Approach in 30 seconds. Prepare for ramp deployment. On schedule, as briefed. Routine. My mouth tasted of bile and incense. My hands were numb around my weapon. I realized my fingers were tracing the edge of my litany chits inside my pouch, rubbing the perforations like a rosary. The paper felt damp, softened by sweat. Somewhere, someone had decided those prayers would be enough. The lander descended. The flak intensified as we dropped closer to the ground. The hull screamed with impacts, each one a reminder that the enemy didn't care about our forms. The cabin tilted sharply, men slammed into straps and each other. I heard bone crack, someone's collar maybe, or just the sound of metal buckles under stress. Then the ramp mechanisms engaged with a heavy hydraulic groan. I knew what was coming, and still my heart tried to crawl up into my throat. The ramp dropped. The world reached in. Hot wind, thick with dust and burning propellant, slammed into the cabin. It carried the stink of churned mud, charred flesh, and industrial chemicals aerosolized by artillery. The noise outside was not one sound but a layered violence. Guns hammering, shells whistling, men shouting, engines roaring. The constant low thunder of bombardment that made the air itself vibrate. The first man in line surged forward on training and terror. A burst of fire cut across the ramp like a scythe. He was simply gone in the middle. Upper body thrown backward, lower body stumbling forward, blood spraying in a sudden fan. The halves fell in different directions, as if even his death couldn't agree on where he belonged. A second man tried to step over him and was hit in the face. The impact snapped his head back, his helmet flew off. Something dark misted into the air. He fell without a sound. The armored trooper shoved us forward anyway. "Move, move, move," he roared, and his voice was swallowed by the battlefield's appetite. I unbuckled my harness with shaking fingers. The buckle resisted for a heartbeat, as if reluctant to release me to what waited outside. Then it clicked free, and the small sound felt like a final blessing. I stepped onto the ramp. Mud clung to my boots immediately, sucking, heavy, greedy. The ground was a slurry of ash and soil and pulverized debris. Shell craters yawned nearby, filled with foul water that reflected the gray sky like dead eyes. Wreckage lay half buried, twisted metal, broken weapons, fragments of vehicles with sacred sigils scorched black. There were signs on stakes, actual administrative signs, marking sectors in painted letters: Zone K4, Objective Line, Rally Point, labels pasted onto hell as if naming it could make it manageable. Men died beside those signs, and the signs remained standing, dutiful and absurd. "Form up," someone shouted. "To the trench line, move." I ran because standing still was death and running was only slightly delayed death. Bullets snapped overhead. Dirt and ash kicked up around my legs. My lungs burned as I sucked in air that tasted of cordite and burned dust. Somewhere, a heavy weapon thumped, each udar vibrating through my ribs. I glanced back once, just once, and saw the lander still there, ramped down, swallowing and vomiting men. A clerk would later record the embarkation as successful. The schedule would remain intact. As I threw myself into the nearest crater for cover, mud splashing up to my knees, I understood something simple and terrible. The battlefield wasn't heroic. It was administrative. It was zones and sectors and objectives. words that tried to domesticate slaughter, and the first cost of routine was always paid in silence, because the dead do not file complaints. I pressed my forehead to the rim of my helmet for a heartbeat, tasting rust on the air, and whispered my confession to myself because no one else could afford to hear it. I was afraid, and fear, like everything else, had been processed, approved, and sent forward on schedule. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter? They gave it a designation instead of a name, because names invite sympathy and sympathy makes men hesitate. On my slate it was Relay Node K Theta, Integrity Point, stamped in red with the same officious certainty as my transit slip. On the battlefield signage it was Objective Comlink, painted on corrugated sheet and hammered into the mud by someone who had probably died before the paint dried. In the officer's mouth it was simply the relay station, spoken with the bored impatience reserved for errands. Lightly contested, they had said in the briefing, and it was the kind of lie that doesn't even bother to disguise itself. The Imperium's lies are not crafted to deceive the enemy. They are crafted to keep you moving. We reached the outer perimeter by crawling, because walking was a promise to every gun in the sector. The ground between our crater and the relay station was a stretch of churned earth that looked like it had been chewed. The mud held things, broken ration tins, snapped lashbacks, fingers in gloves, a helmet half submerged with its devotional icon scratched away. Every meter tasted of ash, every breath scraped my throat raw. The relay station rose from the wasteland like a tooth left in a skull, still standing, still functional in silhouette, but wrong in the way ruin is wrong when it refuses to fall. It was a squat structure of prefabricated plasteel slabs and reinforced shutters, its walls pocked with impact scars. A Vox mast climbed from its roof, thin and crooked, crowned with antennae and prayer strips that snapped in the wind like nervous hands. There were no defenders on the approach. That should have relieved me. It didn't. Silence on an Imperial battlefield is never peace, it's paperwork lag. It's the moment before something catches up. Our squad leader signaled us into position behind a collapsed barricade of sandbags that had long ago turned into sludge. He checked his own slate, lips moving as he matched our location to the grid. Even crouched in filth with rounds cracking somewhere distant, he looked like a man trying to keep a ledger balanced. Objective is to secure the relay and restore comms, he whispered. No heroics, clear it quick. We're behind schedule. Behind schedule. As if the bullets cared. We advanced in pairs, moving from crater to crater, boots sucking, fingers numb around weapon grips slick with moisture. My gloves were caked with mud and something darker that I tried not to identify. Every time I blinked, ash grit scratched my eyelids. The smell was constant, cordite, promethium, wet soil, and the faint coppery sweetness of blood that had been in the air so long it felt like part of the weather. When we reached the station's outer wall, I pressed my back to the cold plasteel and tried to listen through it. I expected voices, shuffling, the whine of machinery. I expected the familiar human mess of a defended position. I heard nothing. A trooper beside me tapped the wall with two knuckles, an old habit, like checking the side of a crate before lifting it. The sound was dull, not hollow, not reassuring, just dull. Our squad leader gestured for the breacher. The breacher was a thick-armed man with a compact charge pouch and the expression of someone who had learned not to imagine. He placed a small strip of explosive at the seam of the access door, murmured the activation litany, because even bombs needed prayer, and set the timer. We crouched, heads tucked, mouths open slightly to equalize pressure. A heartbeat later the charge popped with a sharp crack, not a grand cinematic blast, just a curt, bureaucratic sound of entry. The door buckled inward. Dust puffed out, grey and stale, carrying the cold scent of old air that hadn't been breathed by living lungs in some time. "Move," the leader hissed. We flowed in. Inside, the relay station was lit by emergency lumen panels that cast everything in a sickly blue. The air was cooler, but it wasn't clean. It smelled of burned insulation, old incense, and something else, something like damp paper left to rot. The corridor was narrow, lined with cabling that ran along the walls like veins. My boots echoed softly on metal decking, and that tiny human sound made my stomach tighten. Footsteps were a signature. A signature could be answered. The first room we cleared was a junction bay. Vox equipment racks, power couplings, a shrine niche with a cracked icon. The racks were intact, yet the cables had been rearranged, not severed, not cut, laid out in loops and knots that suggested hands had been at work. Careful hands, patient hands. "Sabotage?" someone whispered. "Quiet," the leader snapped, but his voice had lost some of its hardness. We pushed deeper. The operations chamber was at the heart of the station, a space with 3 operator booths facing a bank of Vox consoles. The chairs were still in place. The consoles still hummed faintly. A Vox slate on the central desk glowed with a dull green runic readout that scrolled endlessly, as if the station refused to accept it had been abandoned. And in each booth, a body sat upright. They wore the station's grey uniforms. Their heads were tilted slightly forward, as if they had been listening closely for a final instruction. Their eyes were open, filmed over with that cloudy sheen that means the moisture has left them and the world no longer matters. Their hands rested on the console edges in a posture that might once have been diligence. Their mouths were full. At first, my mind refused the image, trying to classify it as equipment, as debris, as anything that didn't involve human intent. Then I saw the edges of the paper, folded, crammed, layered, stuffed into their mouths until cheeks bulged. The paper was stamped with forms. The forms were printed with devotional text and administrative headings. Some had torn corners where perforations had been ripped away. A few strips dangled like tongues. One operator had a seal stamp clutched in his stiff fingers, as if he'd tried to certify his own silencing. The smell hit me late, because shock delays everything that might make you break. It was rot, yes, but not the open field rot of bodies left in mud. It was a sealed rot trapped in a small room, mingled with ozone from the Vox systems. Sweet sour decay and burned air. It made my eyes water. It made me swallow bile. A trooper gagged. Another muttered a prayer and crossed himself so hard his fingers shook. I stepped closer to the nearest booth, not because I wanted to, but because my feet moved like they were fulfilling an order I hadn't heard. The operator's throat had bruising along it, dark finger marks. His lips were split where paper had been forced past teeth. The paper was damp with old saliva and something darker, and I could see ink bleeding from stamped headings into the fibers. Forms turned into gags. I realized then that this wasn't random violence. It was a message written in the Imperium's own language. Our leader forced himself to speak. Objective, restore comms. Vox Tech, get that console online. The Vox specialist in our unit, a thin man with an augmented ear and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, moved toward the central console. He knelt, ran a handheld Auspex over the panel, and began to plug in his interface cable with trembling precision. He tried to act like this was any other station, any other repair. His lips moved. I recognized the cant of machine appeasement, not faith, procedure. "Come on," he whispered to the console as if coaxing a stubborn animal. "Come on, come on." The console responded with a crackle. A layered crackle. At first it sounded like ordinary Vox interference, the hiss you get when atmospherics and damaged circuitry distort signal. Then words emerged, faint overlapping, voices speaking at once, not static, not random, us. It was our own voices replayed but wrong in pitch and timing, like a chorus out of sync. Snippets of our compliance phrases, faith is breath, obedience is armor, coming back through the speaker in tones that made my teeth ache. The echo wasn't just sound, It felt like pressure behind my eyes, like the Vox was pressing fingers into my skull and rifling through the soft parts. The Vox specialist froze, his face drained of color. The speaker hissed again, and this time it repeated the squad leader's last whispered instruction. Objective is to secure the relay and restore comms. But it said it with a delay, a mocking cadence, as if savoring the words. I tasted copper. I realized I'd bitten my tongue without noticing. "Shut it down," the leader ordered too sharply. The Vox specialist fumbled for the disconnect, but the cable seemed reluctant, snagged, resisting. The speaker continued, layering more of us, laughter from the lander, a cough from the trench line, the sound of someone vomiting, stitched together into a grotesque tapestry of our arrival. Not just broadcast, recorded, catalogued, like we were being processed by something that loved documentation. I forced myself to do what training demanded: observe, assess, report. My hands found my slate almost without thought, fingers clumsy with grime. I keyed in an anomaly report in the approved format: irregular Vox feedback, possible hostile signal interference, possible heretical broadcast, recommend further analysis. Even as I typed, I knew how it would read in a distant office: sterile, bloodless, a complaint filed properly. I sent the report through the tactical channel, and for a moment there was only the hiss of battlefield noise. Then a reply came back, crisp and cold, stamped in tone if not in wax. Proceed regardless. 2 words that carried the weight of 1,000 dead clerks' indifference. Proceed regardless meant, you are not authorized to be afraid. Proceed regardless meant, the schedule has priority. Proceed regardless meant, if you hesitate, you become the problem. The Vox specialist looked at our leader with pleading eyes. The leader's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out. He raised his weapon, not at an enemy, but at the console, at the station itself, like a man considering whether he could shoot an order. He didn't. Of course he didn't. Instead, he gestured toward the inner access corridor leading deeper into the station, toward maintenance shafts and the base of the Vox mast. "Clear the rest," he said, voice hoarse. "Find the source." We finished the task. I followed because my legs moved. I followed because the Imperium trains obedience into the bones. I followed because the alternative was to stand in that room with the dead operators and listen to my own voice return to me in a tone that wasn't mine. As we moved into the darker corridors, the emergency lights seemed to dim further, or maybe my eyes were simply refusing to see. The air grew colder. The smell of damp paper thickened. My brand itched under my sleeve like a fresh wound being reminded it exists. Somewhere behind us, the Vox speaker crackled again, and I heard my own voice, soft, terrified, almost intimate, repeating a phrase I didn't remember speaking aloud. It sounded like confession. It sounded like the station had been waiting for it. "Do you want me to continue with the next chapter?" The fighting didn't stop because mercy visited us. It stopped because the paperwork needed room to breathe. After the relay station, after the cold corridors and the dead operators with their mouths packed full of forms, we were pushed back into the open and told to hold a shallow trench line that had been scraped from the mud like a wound someone couldn't be bothered to stitch. The bombardment moved elsewhere for a while. Someone higher up had decided another grid square needed to be punished more urgently. And, in that lull, the battlefield became quiet enough for administration to arrive. That is the rhythm of Imperial war. First the guns, then the ledger. A whistle blew, 3 short bursts, clipped and official, and we were ordered into formation near a half-collapsed hab shell that served as a temporary command point. It had once been a worker's dwelling, perhaps, before the shelling peeled its walls away. Now it was just broken rooms and exposed pipes, with a table set up in the least rubble corner and a shrine candle flickering in a chipped cup. The clerks came in a column of grey coats and respirators, escorted by a pair of armed troopers who looked more afraid of the clerks than of any enemy. They brought with them satchels, slates, ink sticks, and the hard certainty that their work mattered more than our lives. Their boots were cleaner than ours. Their gloves were white. Their eyes were pale and flat, as if the light down in the ash depot had bleached them. One of them read from a slate without preamble. "Post-engagement audit commencing," he announced. "All units will present casualty and materiel tallies for verification. Remain available for inspection. Interference will be recorded as obstruction of the Emperor's will." It was said the way you might announce the weather. It was said with the assurance that the Emperor's will came packaged in triplicate. They made us bring the bodies. Not all of them, of course. The battlefield held too many, scattered in craters and smeared into mud. But the ones close enough to retrieve, the ones with tags intact, the ones whose serial marks could still be read, those were dragged in by servitors and by men whose hands had stopped shaking hours ago. The servitors were the worst part, not because they were violent, though they were, in their careless way, but because they were tidy. Each one had a harness frame welded onto its spine with hooks and chains, and it moved with slow certainty, hauling corpses by ankles or wrists and stacking them in lines as if arranging inventory. Their augmetic joints hissed softly. Their lenses clicked as they focused. Their flesh, where visible, was grey and waxy, and the smell around them was a constant of oil and antiseptic trying to mask what they truly were. Punishment made useful. Bodies hit the ground with dull thuds, boots scraped, mud squelched. Someone retched and swallowed it back down when an armed trooper glanced their way. We were ordered to stand beside the rows. That was how it was done, the living paired with the dead, like a witness statement. A clerk handed me a metal stylus, cold, smooth, heavier than it needed to be, and positioned me next to the first line. "You will verify serial marks, as I call them," he said, as if this were a shared duty between comrades. I stared at the nearest corpse. He had been in my lander. I remembered his laugh, one of the ones that had died quickly when the engines began to howl. Now his face was a flattened thing, half-coated in dried mud, his eyelids stiff and half-open. A last burn had cauterized a hole through his chest. The smell around him was not yet fully rot. It was fresh death, iron and bile, and the sourness of emptied bowels. His tags hung from his neck, caked in filth. The clerk did not pause. "Designation," he said. I swallowed and read the tags. He recorded it. The slate beeped, satisfied. "Equipment loss," the clerk continued. "Weapon present?" I looked. The corpse's hands were empty. Somewhere out in the mud his rifle was either lost or taken or melted into slag. The clerk's stylus hovered above the slate, waiting for the answer like a judge waiting for confession. "Absent," I said. He tapped. Another beep. It went like that for everybody. Name replaced by code, death reduced to an entry, grief flattened into checkboxes. I watched the clerk's hand move with bored precision. I watched his glove stay clean by never touching the flesh. I watched him correct a number, then stamp a confirmation rune as if sealing a jar. When we reached a body that had been cut nearly in half by shrapnel, the clerk paused only long enough to ask, "Single individual or composite remains?" I stared at the separated halves, the torn uniform, the exposed ribs, the way the mud had already begun to fill cavities like it was reclaiming him. I wanted to shout that he was a man, not a composite. I wanted to grab the clerk by the throat and force him to look. Instead, I heard myself answer, "Single." The clerk nodded, pleased by clarity, and marked the entry. I began to understand something I had never dared articulate. The Empire keeps better ledgers than it keeps men. It can tell you how many lashbacks were expended in a sector, how many boots were lost to mud, how many doses of stimulant were issued. It can tell you how many bodies must be replaced, and how quickly replacements can be shipped. But it cannot tell you what it costs inside a living skull to stand beside the dead and pretend it is normal. They audited everything, not just bodies. A separate clerk moved down the line inspecting our kits, checking for missing items, comparing our present gear against what had been issued on the manifest. He clicked his tongue when he saw a torn pouch. "Damage not pre-declared," he said. "Responsibility will be assigned, as if blame were another resource to distribute." When he reached me, he examined my litany chits. They were damp and smeared from being handled in mud. One of them had torn along its perforation. I hadn't meant to tear it. My fingers had simply worried it the way a man worries at a wound. The clerk's eyes narrowed. "Chit integrity compromised," he said. "Explain." My throat tightened. "It caught," I managed. "During movement." He looked at his slate. "Witness signature required for material degradation claims." I stared at him, not understanding at first. The words were too absurd to fit into the battlefield. "A witness?" He nodded, already bored with my confusion. "Without witness signature, claim invalid, replacement denied, non-compliance risk increases." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. A man could be torn apart on a ramp, and it would be recorded cleanly, but a torn prayer slip needed a witness. "I have no witness," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's. "Then you accept responsibility," he replied, and tapped his stylus. "Accept responsibility for a piece of paper, in a war where responsibility for deaths was always deferred upward until it vanished into the spires. When the audit ended, we were dismissed in the same way a factory line might be paused and resumed. No speeches, no condolences. Just a series of orders barked by voices that sounded relieved to return to the simpler arithmetic of killing. We went back to our trench line. The guns started again, distant at first, then closer. The day resumed its work. But something had changed in me. That night, the air grew colder, and the mud stiffened with frost-like grime. We huddled under a torn tarp strung between two shattered posts, the fabric flapping in the wind like a dying flag. Somewhere nearby, a field generator whined and sparked, its light casting jittery shadows over our faces. I could smell promethium from a heater unit that barely worked, mixed with the ever-present stink of wet wool and human fatigue. A wounded man lay a few meters away, his leg wrapped in bloody cloth, his teeth clenched around a strip of fabric to keep from screaming whenever the pain surged. We had asked for Medicaid support earlier. The request had been returned with a stamped denial, insufficient authorization, insufficient supplies, insufficient everything. The wounded learned quickly to be quiet because noise drew attention, and attention drew questions, and questions drew clerks. I sat with my back against a sandbag that leaked gritty filler. I held my helmet in my lap, fingers tracing the inner rim where sweat had dried into a salt crust. The inside of the helmet smelled of me, stale breath, fear, and the faint metallic tang of blood from where my lip had split earlier. There was nowhere to speak that wouldn't become evidence. Vox channels were monitored, conversations were overheard. Even prayers could be misheard as dissent if spoken with the wrong tremor. So I confessed into the only private space I had left, the hollow between my mouth and the helmet's inner rim. I whispered my thoughts against the cold composite like it was a confessor's grill. I told it I was afraid. I told it the relay station had spoken back in our own voices. I told it that the dead had been counted like ammunition. I told it that the word routine felt like a curse lodged in my teeth. My breath fogged on the helmet's interior and vanished. The confession left no mark, no seal, no witness signature. That was its only mercy. Above us, loudhailers somewhere in the sector crackled to life and began to broadcast hymns, tinny, distorted, relentless, meant to drown out fear, meant to fill the night with sanctioned sound so that no other whispers could be heard. The hymns were too loud, too constant, like a man praying to keep from hearing footsteps behind him. I pressed my forehead to the helmet and listened to my own breathing. Each inhale tasted of ash. Each exhale felt borrowed. And in the dark, between the distant thumps of artillery and the mechanical chant of the loudhailers, I realized the audit wasn't done with us. It never would be. The Imperium would count us again and again until we were reduced to nothing but corrected numbers. My fear wasn't a weakness, it was a record waiting to be filed. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter? They told us it was a sweep, like you sweep ash from a threshold, a routine clearance. A simple walk through a dead manufactorum to confirm stability and secure production continuity. Those were the words on the order slate, clean clipped phrases that smelled of ink even out here, miles from any office. The slate was stamped twice, because one stamp is never enough to make a lie holy. At dawn, or what passed for dawn beneath a sky the color of old bruises, we were marched off the trench line with a new escort detail and a new timetable. The wind had teeth. It gnawed through my wet uniform and worried at my brand until it itched like an accusation. Frost had not formed. There was too much chemical warmth in the ground, too much residual heat from shelling and leaking pipes. But the cold still found us, a damp, penetrating chill that turned fingers clumsy and made weapons feel like alien objects. The manufactorum rose ahead like a cathedral built for machines and paid for with lungs. From a distance it looked intact. Chimneys, gantries, stacked levels of steel and plasteel, window slots like narrow eyes. Closer you could see the damage, sections of roof peeled back, scaffolds sagging, a conveyor line hanging loose like a tongue. Yet the place was not silent. Even before we reached the outer wall, I heard it. A steady, distant thrum, the pulse of motors that should not have been running. The sound made my molars ache, a low vibration that crawled up the bones. "By order of command," our squad leader said, reading from his slate as we approached the perimeter fence, "we will enter and verify the status of Line 12, restore function if degraded, remove hostile presence if encountered, do not interfere with sanctified machinery. Do not interfere," as if we were invited guests in a temple, not soldiers dragging our fear behind us like a chain. The outer gate had once been guarded by armed workers and a shrine servitor that blessed incoming shipments with oil. Now the guard posts were empty, their viewing slits clogged with soot. The shrine servitor lay on its side in the mud, half buried, its metal hands still folded in prayer. Someone had scraped its faceplate away, leaving a raw oval of exposed wiring. It stared sightlessly at the sky, and I felt an ugly kinship with it. We entered through a breach in the fence where the metal had been cut and bent outward. Not blasted, cut, neat work, deliberate. The first sign that whatever had touched this place did not waste effort. Inside, the yard was littered with pallets and broken crates. Some split open to reveal their contents, shell casings, machine parts, devotional tokens mass-produced by the thousand. The tokens, tiny stamped icons, glittered in the dirt like spilled teeth. I stepped on one and felt it bite into my boot sole. The main doors into the manufactorum were half open, as if the building itself was holding its mouth ajar. Above them, a faded sign in High Gothic proclaimed the facility's designation and its blessing, but so many amendments had been riveted over the original lettering that the words read like a stutter. Plates on plates on plates, each one correcting, revising, superseding, until meaning became a layered scar. We went in. The air changed instantly. Outside had been cold and dirty. Inside was warm and wet, thick with coolant mist. It smelled of machine oil, ozone, and old iron, an industrial scent so familiar it should have been comforting. It wasn't. Beneath it lay another odor, faint but persistent, burned paper. Not fresh smoke, not char. Burned paper ground fine and inhaled over time, the smell of records destroyed and still remembered. The first hall was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow. Catwalks crisscrossed above like ribs. Conveyor belts ran in parallel lines, each moving at a steady pace. They should have been still. There were no workers, no overseers, no chants from labor crews, and yet the belts moved with mindless devotion, carrying their loads toward stamping presses that rose and fell with a slow ritual certainty. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. Each press came down like a judge's gavel, indifferent to what lay beneath. The belts carried shells, unpainted, unfinished, rolling in shallow trays. They also carried bone. At first I thought the pale fragments were scrap material, some kind of ceramic. Then one of the pieces rotated under a lumen glow, and I saw the curve of a jaw, the delicate structure of teeth. The belt did not pause. It carried shells and bones together, as if both were equally acceptable components for the war effort. A trooper beside me whispered, "Emperor preserve," and his voice sounded too loud in that vast humming space. Our leader raised a hand for silence, and we advanced in a staggered line between the moving belts. Every step clanged softly on metal grating. The coolant mist dampened our uniforms, beading on gun barrels. Somewhere overhead, a chain hoist squealed as it shifted under its own weight, a sound like an animal being slowly skinned. Hazard signs lined the route, yellow plates with black script, warning of pressure lines cutting equipment, blessed machinery. But the signs had been amended so many times that new plates overlapped old, arrows pointing in contradictory directions. One sign read caution, steam release, and beneath it, riveted crookedly, another plate read caution, no steam present. Beneath that, a third read caution, steam may return without notice. The warnings had become a kind of scripture, endless, self-correcting, never truly helpful. The Imperium's idea of safety is always retroactive. We reached a junction where 3 corridors branched off, each lit by flickering red lumen strips. A door panel blinked with a machine spirit rune requesting input. The Vox specialist, still pale from the relay station incident, approached and pressed his palm against the reader. The panel accepted him. That small acceptance chilled me. Machines are not supposed to be welcoming. Machines in Imperial service are suspicious and stubborn. They demand prayer. They demand ritual. This one accepted him with a soft chime, like a polite clerk stamping a form. The door slid open, and a wave of colder air spilled out, carrying the smell of wet ash. Beyond was a narrower production hall. Here, the noise was harsher, grinding gears, chain drives, the constant rattle of loose metal. The coolant mist was thicker, fogging my vision. Through it, lights blinked on control panels like diseased eyes. The conveyor belts here carried different things. Bundles wrapped in canvas, sealed crates, and occasionally something that looked like a limb until the fog shifted and proved it was. We moved slowly, weapons raised, every sense stretched taut. The presses continued their ritual behind us, thumping like a distant heart that refused to die. And then the cold came. Not the ambient chill of metal and mist. A sudden, invasive cold that sank into my teeth and made my breath catch. It rolled through the corridor like an unseen wave. My brand flared with a sharp itch. The hairs on my neck lifted under my collar. Men felt it too. I saw shoulders tighten, saw eyes widen slightly behind visors. No one spoke at first, because speaking would make it real, and reality out here had a way of becoming official. A trooper at the rear of the column muttered, "Did anyone?" He stopped. Not because someone shushed him. His mouth simply froze mid-word, jaw working soundlessly. His eyes darted, confused, like he'd forgotten what language was supposed to do. I felt it then, too, a momentary blankness, like a form in my mind had been erased, and I couldn't remember what had been written there. I tried to recall the compliance phrase we were supposed to recite at intervals, and for 3 heartbeats I could not. The words were gone, as if scraped away. Fear crawled under my ribs. We rounded a corner, and I saw something move between the machines. Not clearly, never clearly. Just a shift in the mist, a shadow slipping behind a column. Too tall to be a man, and too thin to be a servitor. The movement was wrong, smooth where it should have been mechanical, deliberate where it should have been random. My eyes tried to focus and failed, sliding off the shape as if my mind refused to give it edges. "Contact," our leader hissed. No one answered, because no one was sure they had permission to acknowledge what they'd seen. The shadow moved again, closer this time. The cold deepened. A control panel nearby sparked, and the tiny flash illuminated the mist for a split second. I glimpsed something pale and angular, like a face made from folded paper or stripped wire. Then it was gone, swallowed by fog and machinery noise. My weapon rose without conscious thought. Training took over where understanding failed. I aimed at the last place I'd seen movement and fired. The muzzle flash punched a hole in the mist, bright and brutal. The recoil jolted up my arms and into my shoulder, vibrating the bones. The sound of the shot was swallowed by the manufacturer's constant grind, but the flash revealed a fraction of the corridor, bolted panels, a ladder, a hanging chain, and nothing else. No impact, no scream, no sign of blood, just the cold and the sense of being watched by something that did not blink. Then, from somewhere deeper in the hall, behind the presses, beyond the belts, inside the walls themselves, came a sound that made my stomach drop. Paper tearing, not the gentle rustle of parchment, not the ripping of canvas. Paper tearing in long, deliberate strips, as if someone were carefully destroying a stack of forms one sheet at a time. The sound threaded through the machinery noise like a whispered insult. It was intimate, it was bureaucratic, it felt like sacrilege committed with clean hands. The Vox specialist flinched and looked toward the sound. "That," he began, and his voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "That's not, there shouldn't be paper down here." But there was always paper, wasn't there? In every place the Imperium touched, there was paper. Work orders, compliance sheets, blessing tags, inventory forms. The whole empire ran on parchment and blood, and here in this half-dead factory someone or something was tearing the paper as if rejecting the very language of control. Our leader's voice came low and strained. "Maintain formation, continue advance. We locate line 12 and the central control shrine. No deviation. No deviation, even now, even here." We pushed on. The corridor narrowed further, the fog thickening until my vision shrank to a tunnel of dim red light and damp metal. My breath sounded loud inside my helmet. Each inhale tasted of coolant and rust. Each exhale fogged my visor edges. Somewhere ahead, the shadow moved again, just out of sight, always keeping the perfect distance that made pursuit feel like obedience. Men began to forget small things. A trooper asked twice what our objective was, and both times our leader answered with increasing anger, as if the question itself were disloyal. Another trooper stopped walking for a moment, staring at his own hands as if unsure what they were for. When he started again, his steps were uneven, like a man learning to march from scratch. I clenched my jaw until it hurt. I recited the compliance phrases silently, forcing the words to take shape in my head like nails hammered into soft wood. Faith is breath. Obedience is armor. The phrases tasted stale, but they were structure, and structure was all that kept the mind from spilling out. We reached an access hatch leading down into a service tunnel. The hatch was open, not broken. Open, like an invitation. A small shrine plate beside it bore a stamped warning, "Authorized personnel only." Beneath it, someone had scratched new words with a crude tool, "All are authorized in the end." The cold surged again, and for a moment I could swear the metal under my boots pulsed, as if the manufacturer had a heartbeat that was not its own. Our leader looked down the hatch into darkness. The red light from above did not reach far. It died quickly, swallowed by black. From below rose that faint, steady sound, paper tearing, and beneath it, a whisper of something like breathing. My fingers tightened around my weapon until my knuckles ached. I realized my hands were shaking again, not from cold this time, but from the awful certainty that the routine sweep had become something else entirely. We had been sent into a place where machines still prayed without priests, where bones rode conveyor belts like acceptable cargo, where the air itself stole words from men's mouths. I wanted to confess aloud, to tell them what my gut already knew, that we were not clearing a factory. We were being processed. And whatever stalked between the machines was not interested in our bodies alone. It wanted our order, our language, our records. It wanted to tear the paperwork of our souls into strips and feed it to the belts. Our leader made the sign of the Emperor over the hatch. It looked less like faith and more like someone warding off a stain. "Down," he said. We began to climb. They finally named it. Not the thing in the mist, not the cold that stole words, not the paper tearing that sounded like a cleric shredding sins. No. The Imperium does not name horrors, it names responses, it names procedures, it names the shape of the cage it is about to close. The order arrived through the Vox at midday, when the Manufactorum's service tunnels spat us back into open air like a throat rejecting spoiled meat. We emerged coated in coolant residue and ash, our boots slick, our fingers cramped from gripping weapons too long. The sky above was still that bruised grey, low enough to feel like a lid. Somewhere distant, artillery continued to argue with the horizon. I remember thinking, foolishly, that at least outside the machines, air behaved like air. Then the loudhailers started. They were mounted on poles and ruined walls, their housings dented and blessed with little purity tags that fluttered like insects. They crackled for a long moment, swallowing static, as if even the equipment needed to clear its throat before speaking damnation. When the voice came, it wasn't a person's voice. It was a choir of filters and authority, clipped and absolute. Attention all Imperial personnel within sector designation K Theta through K Lambda. Quarantine protocols enacted. Cordon established. Unauthorized egress will be met with lethal force. This measure is mercy. Mercy. The word landed like a slap. Mercy meant the paperwork had reached the point where they no longer needed us alive to keep the numbers tidy. A second channel cut in, Command Vox, tighter bandwidth, no hymnal padding. Our squad leader held the receiver close to his helmet, as if proximity could soften what came through. "Unit designation confirmed," the voice said. "You are hereby classified as potentially compromised. Maintain position. Await further instructions. Extraction pending review." Pending review, the phrase that has killed more men than enemy fire. It is the Administratum's way of telling you the decision has already been made, but the ink is still drying. A few of the men looked up at the sky as if a ship might descend immediately, bright and clean, with a ramp and warm hands. I didn't look. I had seen too many ramps. Ramps are just places where the world reaches in. The cordon formed with obscene efficiency. Within an hour, the perimeter was marked by fresh signposts hammered into the mud. Quarantine line, do not cross. Red paint so bright it looked wet. Servo skulls drifted along the boundary, their lenses scanning, their speakers muttering warnings in monotone. Beyond them, silhouettes moved, other Imperial troops, faceless at distance, setting up heavy weapons in the manner of men preparing to shoot at their own reflection. They did not wave. They did not hail us. They behaved as if we were already dead, and were simply waiting for the official confirmation. The air itself changed as the sanctifiers came. At first it was a faint chemical bite, like cleaning solvent spilled in a hab corridor. Then it thickened into a choking fog that rolled low across the ground, pumped from canisters and sprayers mounted on wheeled rigs. The mist caught in our throats and burned. It made tears run without sadness, stinging tracks down cheeks, pooling in the corners of eyes and then drying gritty. Men coughed and spat, and the spit came out tinged pink. "Sanctification dispersal," a loudhailer announced cheerfully. "Inhale shallow. Purity is discomfort. Discomfort is proof." I tried to obey, shallow breaths controlled, the kind of breathing you do when you're trying not to smell something. But the sanctifier had a heavy, oily tang beneath the sharpness, like overused incense mixed with industrial bleach. It settled on the tongue and would not leave. It coated my teeth. It made the inside of my helmet smell like a tomb scrubbed by a frantic priest. And beneath it, faint, persistent. I still caught that burned paper scent from the manufacturer, like a memory you can't wash off. The loudhailers changed their tune and began to blare hymns, not sung by living throats, broadcast recordings, distorted by damaged speakers. The melodies were familiar, meant to comfort, but played through crackling amplifiers, they became something else, endless, grinding, inescapable. The hymns didn't lift the spirit, they pinned it down. They filled every gap where a whisper might grow. I understood then the hymns weren't for us, they were for the record. Proof that morale measures were applied. Proof that the proper rites were observed before disposal. We were assigned a holding area, an open yard between broken habshells and collapsed barricades. The ground was stamped flat by boots and servitor treads. A field command tent had been erected there, its canvas marked with warning sigils and purity seals. A clerk sat inside at a folding table writing steadily as if the war were happening only on paper. We lined up again, always lines. Names, the clerk called, without looking up. We gave codes, he wrote. His stylus scratched like an insect chewing wood. Any symptoms, he asked. The question was a trap made of syllables. If you said yes, you were compromised. If you said no, you were either lying or too stupid to recognize corruption, both punishable in different ways. Men hesitated. The clerk's head tilted slightly, annoyed by delay. A trooper 2 places ahead of me spoke, cough, since the sanctifiers. The clerk did not react with concern, he reacted with procedure. Step aside, marked for secondary screening. 2 armed escorts moved in, guiding the trooper away. The trooper's eyes widened. It's just, he began. The escort's hand tightened on his shoulder, he stopped talking. The line advanced. When my turn came, I felt the weight of my own body like evidence. My throat burned from the chemicals. My mind still felt frayed, as if words could slip away at any moment. I swallowed and spoke my designation. Symptoms? The clerk asked. I wanted to confess everything. The cold in the manufacturer, the way men forgot phrases, the paper tearing, the vox echoes, the dead operators gagged on forms. I wanted to pour it out like blood and demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge it was not routine, not acceptable, not within thresholds. Instead I said, none. The clerk stamped a mark on my slate, returned to holding, await review. That stamp felt heavier than any bullet. In the holding area, the real quarantine began, not with fences and guns, but with suspicion. Men started watching each other the way clerks watch ledgers scanning for irregularities, a tremor in a hand, a delay in responding to an order, a prayer spoken with the wrong cadence, a man sleeping too deeply, a man staring too long at nothing. Every human quirk became potential heresy. A fight broke out near the ration crate. It started over water, always water. A thin corporal tried to ration it according to the issued slate, pouring measured amounts into dented cups. A trooper pushed forward, demanding more, his eyes wild with the dry panic of sanctifier-burned lungs. You're not my clerk, the trooper snarled. You don't get to decide. The corporal raised his cup, voice trembling with authority he didn't truly have. I'm assigned, it's logged, back off. The trooper struck him, a dull punch. The corporal fell into the mud, cup spilling. Water sank into dirt instantly, vanishing like mercy. Others moved in, some to restrain, some to join. It became a knot of bodies, boots sliding, fists thudding. Someone shouted, traitor, without knowing why. Someone else shouted, contaminated, like it was a spell. A gun butt swung, teeth cracked. Blood mixed with sanctifier residue on the ground and turned pink and foamy. The armed escorts did not intervene until the paperwork demanded it. When they did, they intervened with stun batons and the cold efficiency of men authorized to hurt their own. Afterward, the corporal lay with a broken nose, breathing wetly. The trooper who had hit him was dragged away, wrists bound. The clerk inside the tent made a note. The incident was now contained, classified, and filed. At night, the loudhailers did not stop. The hymns went on and on, cycling through verses until meaning dissolved into repetition. The sounds soaked into bones. It made sleep shallow and sick. Every time my eyes closed, I heard the paper tearing again beneath the music, like a hidden rhythm mocking the sanctioned one. I lay under a strip of tarp with two others, our bodies pressed close not for comfort but for warmth, and tried to keep my thoughts in order. Thoughts, I had begun to suspect, were the one thing the quarantine truly targeted. Not infection, not mutation. Uncertainty. I clung to my confession silently, repeating it in my head like a rosary with no beads. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, I am still myself. But even as I repeated it, I could feel something listening, not through ears, but through attention. The way a clerk listens for inconsistencies, the way a machine listens for the wrong frequency, the way a predator listens for the moment a herd animal limps. A man in the next cluster began whispering to himself. At first it sounded like prayer, then I realized the cadence was wrong. It was too measured, too formal, like he was reading from a form. I hereby acknowledge, he whispered, that my thoughts are property of the throne. I hereby acknowledge, I hereby... His voice rose in panic. I hereby... He stopped, gasped, then began again as if compelled. I hereby acknowledge... Two men tried to hush him. He slapped their hands away, eyes rolling, mouth moving too fast. Then he screamed, a raw cracking sound that cut through the hymns for a heartbeat. The armed escorts arrived, batons out, and dragged him away while he kicked and recited acknowledgements between sobs. No one spoke after that. In the dim chemical haze, faces looked gaunt and unfamiliar. Shadows moved strangely under the hymn lights. Each man became a potential report waiting to happen. And then, near midnight, the command vox sparked again. Short burst, formal tone. Update, it said. Quarantine remains in effect. Extraction pending review. Maintain discipline. Prepare for possible cleansing operations. Clean words for filthy acts. That was when the hopelessness truly settled into me, heavy as wet cloth. Not fear of death, we had been living with that since the ramp dropped, but the knowledge of how death would come, not as a battle, not as a last stand sung in hymns, but as an administrative conclusion. A signature applied from afar. I pressed my gloved hand to the inside of my helmet, finding the place where I had whispered earlier confessions, and I continued in silence, because silence was the only channel not yet fully monitored. I confessed that I did not trust my own thoughts anymore. I confessed that every hymn sounded like a muzzle being loaded. I confessed that when the loudhailer said mercy, I tasted promethium. Above us, beyond the cordon, the sky remained closed and indifferent. No ships descended, no ramp opened. Only the perimeter lights blinked, patient and bureaucratic, counting time until someone decided our category was no longer pending. In the Imperium there is no true quarantine. There is only delay between suspicion and burning. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter? The purge was not announced like a battle. It was announced like a correction. At first there was only a change in the hymns. The loudhailers that had tormented us for 2 days, endless devotional loops, distorted chorales, the Emperor's name chewed into static, shifted to a simpler chant. A single verse repeated, stripped of ornament, made harsh by the speaker's damaged cones. It sounded less like worship and more like an instruction being drilled into a machine that refused to learn. Cleanse to preserve, it said. Cleanse to preserve. Cleanse to preserve. The words had no warmth. They were just an approved phrase, rolled over and over until it became soundless inside the mind, a wheel turning without traction. I lay under my strip of tarp with my helmet pulled close, listening to the chant and the wet coughs of men trying not to be noticed. The sanctifier mist still hung low over the yard, catching the weak lumen light and turning it into a pale soup. Everything smelled of chemicals and fatigue and fear, and beneath it all that faint burnt paper ghost, like a reminder that the world could be erased if someone signed the right line. I did not sleep. None of us truly slept. We dozed in short, guilty drops, always waking with a jerk when a distant explosion rattled the ruins, or when a nearby man twitched too sharply and everyone flinched at the thought of symptoms. Even rest had become suspicious. Then, sometime in the grey hour that might have been morning, the perimeter lights changed. The cordon had been marked by red lumens on poles, steady, patient, bureaucratic. That morning they began to strobe in a new pattern, a faster pulse that made the shadows jump. Servo skulls drifted along the line with renewed purpose, lenses bright, speakers muttering in clipped bursts. I could hear new voices on distant Vox channels, short confirmations, numbers exchanged, coordinates repeated. The sound was familiar, the sound of an operation being executed by people who would not be standing where the consequences landed. Our squad leader was roused by a runner from the command tent, a pale clerk's assistant in a helmet too big for his head. The runner shoved a sealed chit into the leader's hand and practically fled, as if the paper were hot. The leader broke the seal. He read. I watched his eyes move across the lines and felt my stomach tighten with a certainty I didn't want to name. He swallowed. His throat bobbed like a man trying to push down a stone. Attention, he said, voice rough. We have new orders. Someone laughed once, sharp and ugly. Extraction? The leader's gaze flicked up, and there was something in it that I had only seen on corpses, an absence of future. No, he said, authorized cleansing. The yard went very still. It wasn't silence exactly. The hymn still played. The distant guns still argued with the horizon. The wind still pushed chemical mist through the broken walls. But inside the men, something went quiet, like a door closing. Authorized cleansing meant one thing. Someone far away had looked at our sector on a map and decided it was cheaper to burn than to understand. A signature had been placed where we could not see it. A seal had been pressed into wax with that soft, final click. Cleansing operations were always framed as mercy, mercy for the wider Imperium, mercy for the purity of the record, mercy for the administrators who did not want an anomaly lingering on their ledgers. A few men began to speak at once, voices rising. We're loyal, we held the line, we followed protocol, we're not. Words tumbled out in frantic, pleading heaps, as if devotion could be piled high enough to form a wall against fire. A commissarial escort, one of those faceless figures who had been watching us more than the enemy ever did, stepped forward and raised his sidearm. He didn't point it at any one man, he pointed it at the air, like a symbol of where authority lived. Silence, he said. This measure is sanctified, sanctified. As if holiness could be poured from a nozzle. The loudhailers cracked again, the chant replaced by a formal announcement, the kind of tone used for shifts and rations and curfew. Sector K Theta through K Lambda, purification will commence. Remain in place. This is mercy. Do not flee. Flight is admission. I felt the words lodge in my ribs. Remain in place. Do not flee, like livestock being told the slaughterhouse is benevolence. Some men tried anyway. The first to run was a young trooper with a bandaged arm and eyes full of raw animal refusal. He bolted toward a gap between two ruined hab shells, boots splashing through sanctifier slick mud. For a heartbeat I felt something in my own legs answer him, a reflex older than duty. Then the perimeter guns spoke. A heavy stubber stuttered from beyond the cordon, its rounds cracking the air. The trooper's back erupted in a spray of red, and he pitched forward, sliding in the mud for a few meters before coming to rest face down. The cordon had teeth, and it did not hesitate. The body twitched once. Then it was still. A servo skull drifted closer and hovered above him, lens whirring as if recording the correction. No one else ran after that. The lesson had been delivered in the only language the Imperium trusts, immediate consequence. We waited, waiting again, waiting with the knowledge that nothing we did could change the schedule, waiting while the sky above us thickened with smoke from distant fires, and the chemical haze turned the sun into a pale smear. Men sat down in the mud because standing felt pointless. Some prayed aloud, loudly, desperately, making sure witnesses could hear. Some sat in silence, mouths moving without sound as they tried to remember litanies that had slipped away in the manufactorum. I held my helmet in my lap. I stared at the inner rim where I had whispered confessions, as if the plastic and metal might offer absolution. My hands shook. Not with fear now, but with a kind of exhausted anger that had nowhere to go. Then the first light came, not the flicker of lumen strips, not the glow of flares, a hard, descending brightness that painted the haze from above, turning it into a glowing veil. I looked up and saw shapes in the cloud cover, dark silhouettes moving with deliberate slowness, orbital assets, or atmospheric strike craft. It didn't matter which. What mattered was the way they moved, not hunting, not reacting, but executing a plan. The air began to vibrate with a distant rumble that grew steadily, like a massive furnace door being dragged open. The smell of promethium intensified, cutting through sanctifier stench. Men began to whimper. Someone screamed at the sky, wordless. A second announcement came, almost gentle. Purification in progress. All personnel be still, be still. As if stillness could make you invisible to fire. First strike hit the far edge of the sector, beyond our line of sight. The ground shuddered under us. A bloom of light rose behind a collapsed tower, bright enough to turn the world into a negative image for an instant. Then came the sound, an enormous rolling concussion that pushed air into my chest and made my ears ring. Heat followed, even from that distance, a wave that dried tears on cheeks and made the chemical mist boil off the ground in ghostly curls. The second strike was closer. A column of flame descended from the sky like a judgment made physical. It struck a cluster of ruins and turned them into a single roaring brightness. The edges of broken walls glowed red, then sagged. The air filled with a new scent, paint burning, plastic melting, flesh cooking, an odor so thick it felt like it had weight. Men ran in circles inside the yard, not trying to escape the cordon now, but trying to outrun the inevitability inside their own minds. Others dropped to their knees and pressed foreheads into mud, praying until their throats bled. I remember the absurd detail that came to me in that moment. Somewhere, a clerk would be updating a ledger. Purification executed as per authorization, sector corrected, anomaly removed. The words would be neat, the signatures would be dry. The third strike turned the command tent into vapor. One moment the canvas stood, stamped with purity seals and warning sigils, the clerk inside still writing because writing was all he knew. The next moment the world fled white, and the tent was gone. The air, where it had been shimmered with heat, papers, pulped, ash black, fluttered upward like dead moths. I saw a sheet of parchment spin past, its stamped heading briefly visible before it caught fire mid-air and became nothing. Fire in the records. The clerk's logic made holy. If a thing cannot be corrected, it is erased. The heat intensified until it felt like my skin was trying to peel away from my bones. The sanctifier residue on my uniform began to sting, reacting to the flame and turning into a chemical burn. Men's hair singed. Some screamed as their clothes caught. Others made no sound at all, mouths open, eyes wide, as if their minds had finally exceeded acceptable thresholds and shut down. A shrine plate bolted to a nearby wall began to melt. It had been an icon, metallic, stamped, the Emperor's symbol raised in relief. Under the heat, the edges softened and sagged, the holy symbol warping into an obscene shape, as if even devotion could be deformed by sufficient flame. The purity seals on it curled and blackened, their wax dripping like tears. I tried to move, but the world had become a series of urgent sensory commands. Breathe, blink, swallow, don't fall. My boots stuck in the mud, now drying and cracking under heat, turning to a baked crust that still held bodies underneath. The air was so hot it burned my lungs. Each inhale felt like swallowing knives. Somewhere nearby, the commissarial escort was shouting something, orders perhaps, or prayers, or both, but his voice was lost in the roar. The Emperor's hymns on the loudhailers continued for a few seconds longer, distorted beyond recognition. Then the speakers melted or shorted out and the sound cut off abruptly. The sudden absence of sanctioned noise was almost worse. It left room for raw human screams and the crackle of burning everything. I saw men turn into silhouettes against the flames, then collapse. I saw a servitor stumble forward, its flesh cooking under its augmetics, still trying to fulfill whatever last directive it had been given. It reached out with a metal hand toward a burning crate, and the hand softened, fingers drooping like wax. Still it reached, because obedience does not stop at death. I realized then that there would be no heroic ending, no last stand that meant anything. We were being erased, and the erasure itself was the point. I ran, not toward the cordon, not toward escape, but toward shadow. Between two collapsed walls I found a drainage channel, a culvert half buried and choked with debris. The opening was low, rimmed with rust. I dropped to my knees and shoved myself into it, scraping my armor against the metal. The inside smelled of old sewage, wet ash, and rat decay. Horrible, but cool compared to the furnace outside. Behind me, the world roared. Inside the culvert, darkness wrapped around me like a filthy blanket. I crawled forward on elbows and knees, mouth full of dust. The air was stale but breathable. The heat outside was still there, radiating through the metal but muted. I pressed my cheek to the damp floor and tasted grime and rust and something bitter. I held my helmet close, fingers white on its rim. My confession had nowhere to go now. There were no clerks to record it, no Vox channels to transmit, no witnesses, only me. I tried to remember my name, the one my mother had used. It came to me in fragments, blurred by fear and years of being called by code. I clung to those fragments like a man clings to a rung over a pit. Outside, another strike hit, close enough that the culvert vibrated and dust rained down from its ceiling. The sound was like the sky being torn open. The air inside filled with fine ash that coated my tongue and made me cough. I coughed into my sleeve and tasted smoke. My eyes watered. I forced myself to breathe shallow, like the loudhailers had instructed. Even here, even now, I obeyed. Because that is what routine does to you. It trains your body to comply even when compliance is pointless. I lay in the culvert, listening to the sector die above me, and understood the final truth. Routine is not a promise of safety. It is an administrative euphemism for sacrifice. It is the word they use when they have already decided you won't be returning, and they want you to walk calmly into the flames so the records stay neat. If this confession survives, scratched into memory, carried in whatever scraps of self I have left, then let it stand as the only witness I can offer. I did everything they told me. I signed every line. I recited every phrase. I remained in place, and the fire still came, on schedule.